Hey there. In this module, Module 60, we'll be talking about the causes of declining biodiversity. So, one major cause of biodiversity loss is going to be habitat destruction. A species, as we know, is a habitat is determined by not only its biotic but its abiotic factors. And some species are going to be more specialized than others, and so they can live in just a smaller range. And so if those specific habitats are affected, those species are going to be more susceptible to becoming endangered and extinct. And so habitats are lost when we develop agricultural fields, shopping malls, houses, etc. Whenever we are removing habitats. Habitats can be savannas, they can be forests. We oftentimes just think of forests, but um, desert dune or dunes on the coast and grasslands are all different habitats for specific organisms. And so an example of this, a famous example, is a spotted owl in the northwest North American uh, forests. They require moist, wet coniferous trees, and a single breeding pair requires 1,600 acres of old growth forest. They require these very, very large coniferous trees. And to have a sustainable population, you're going to need 20 pairs to be viable. And so this is a large amount of land that has to have a very specific habitat to maintain just this one species. And so if that habitat is lost or broken up, if it becomes two smaller habitats or um, yes, then it will those breeding pairs or those that population is going to be affected negatively. And actually, with the spotted owls, there's a big controversy about whether or not to put them on the endangered species list because if we do, then that habitat uh, is protected and we wouldn't be able to log it anymore. And that's in an area of the world where there's not a lot of industry and they sustain themselves on the logging of these trees, and they are very valuable. And so there are many people that think that we should not be logging these trees so that we can protect the endangered species, but that there's a whole bunch of people that think that we should not put them on the endangered species list. So deforestation is thought to be a major cause for habitat loss. However, it's not the only cause. So we have shrublands and woodlands, and also grasslands and desert habitats have also been lost. So it's not just cutting down trees. All habitats support different organisms or different populations, and so therefore they each are essential. And in the United States, we have less than half the wetlands that existed in the 1600s. In fact, for years in the 60s, we thought it was a great idea to fill in wetlands so that we could build bridges to get rid of mosquitoes, just fill in the wetlands. And so now we have not quite as much as we did back then. And so we used to have, 20 million acres of the Everglades has been filled just for agriculture. So that is a movement that is no longer in existence because wetlands is very biodiverse and very essential. In the Caribbean Sea, we have coral reefs, and corals are also have abundance of biodiversity. And in 1992, the amount of living coral in the Caribbean Sea was at 30%, but we are currently down to 8% of the coral still being alive in the Caribbean Sea. And this is going to be caused, or this is caused by warming oceans, ocean acidification, turbidity from runoff into rivers, and coral collectors taking pieces of corals. So remember that turbidity is the amount of stuff floating in the water, suspended solids floating in the water that's going to block the light so that the sunlight can't get to the corals, and then the corals aren't able to photosynthesize. So habitats can also be affected without complete habitat destruction. You don't have to cut down the whole field in order for the field to be affected. And so we saw an example of this with the Florida panthers and the genetic diversity. They do still have habitat. However, because the panther requires requires such a large range of area, the populations became small or have become small, And so with the smaller populations, the genetic diversity has become less. It has bottlenecked. And so you're going to have long-term effects there. So we haven't completely just removed all of their habitat. However, it does still have effects. And so populations that have less room are going to have less options. So, for example, if you think about on a hot day, if a population tends to move up a mountain to find cooler climate, they may not be able to get there anymore if that habitat or if their access to the mountain has been cut off by a highway system. And so you're going to have this is going to affect the population size and the biodiversity, because you're starting to push these animals or organisms and plants into this range of physiological stress where they can still survive, but they are not doing much more than surviving. They're not necessarily reproducing. So with optimal amounts of land, you're going to have optimal conditions and larger populations. An example of a species that's actually doing very well because of habitat destruction is having negative effects on other organisms. So the brown-headed cowbird, which is a pretty cool bird, is a parasite to other birds. It's going to lay its eggs into the nest of another bird and have another bird raise it. These eggs tend to hatch earlier, and the birds will grow sooner, and so they can oftentimes outcompete the already existing birds, and so this tends to have a bad or negative effect on the populations because they are being outcompeted by these brown-headed cowbirds. And this is happening because as we remove or as we deforest or remove habitats, the brown-headed cowbirds live on the edge of open areas, on the edge of agricultural areas, or in open areas. So as we continue to remove forested areas, we're opening up more and more of their habitat. And so we look at our next example, or our next reason why biodiversity is on the decline. And in order to do that, we have to investigate what native species are. Native species are species that live in their historical range, meaning that they've been there probably from anywhere between thousands to millions of years. So remember that evolution happens, and in a macroevolution, it happens at in a millions of years timeline. We don't just see big changes in just a few generations. And so our organisms have co-evolved with other species. And so there's a delicate balance between populations. Whoever eats whoever is going to keep that population in balance. So if we go back to the famous example of the lynx and the hare, you can see that the hare population is kept in balance by the lynx, but the lynx is also kept in balance by the hare. And so if you were to remove one of those species, you would see a result in the other. And so if you were to take the lynx and move it to another part of the world where there was no hare, actually, let me go back. If you were to take the hare and move that to another part of the world where there was no lynx, where there was no predator, you're going to see that there is no predators there, or there may not be a predator there. And if there are no predators there, it could potentially outcompete and become very prolific. And so, in most cases, exotic species fail to establish successful populations. So an exotic species is something that is introduced. So if we were to take that hare out of its natural habitat where it's native to and bring it into a new part of the world, it would be an exotic or an alien. But it's not quite an invasive yet. In order for something to be an invasive, it would have to be highly successful. And so if it doesn't have any predators, and if it can outcompete the surrounding organisms, then it can choke biodiversity, and that is going to be when we see exotics become invasive. Another fun little example of an invasive species is the European earthworm. We always seem to look really fondly upon earthworms because it does so much work in our gardens. However, back in the 1600s, we used to have a very densely packed forest with many trees. And this is because we had lots of leaf litter on the ground, and nothing was there to break it down and to bring those nutrients back down into the soil, which is what worms do. They eat the leaf litter and they excrete it down here. And so because there's this insulated area, saplings had a great chance to grow and then to emerge and to grow trees. And so we had lots of trees. But now that we have earthworms here breaking down this leaf litter, these smaller seeds like grasses and plants have the opportunity to sprout up and to outcompete these trees. And so we are finding that we are losing tree density. And if this persists, then we are slowly moving towards a grassland in the future. But that would be very far in the future. The dodo here is the sort of the poster child for extinctions. So when Europeans sailed to new lands, they accidentally brought rats, and because flightless birds are kind of defenseless, they have their nests on the ground. You know that flightless birds are on islands generally where there are no predators, because their nests are on the ground and they're completely defenseless. They're a bird that can't fly. They are kind of like chicken nuggets. So these examples are like the dodo or the kiwi. And so what happened when we brought rats onto islands with flightless birds, the rats would go to the nests and eat the eggs in this decimated flightless bird populations. So exotic species can move around the world, and in the 1900s, we actually encouraged farmers to plant kudzu. And so this is a kudzu plant. It's a vine. It's actually a pretty nice looking plant, but it has been very, very abundant, and there are no predators. And so predators being herbivores in the southwest of the United States. And so it has been very prolific, and it has choked out many species because it's just so successful. And cargo ships have been bringing ballast water into the Great Lakes. So what happens is, if you have these large cargo boats, we need to make them stable in the water, so they pick up ocean water from Europe or from Asia, and it sits in the bottom of the boat. And this is to give it stability as it crosses the ocean. And then when we get to the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is just here, you can see how all of these lakes are connected to one another. So if you bring something in the St. Lawrence Seaway, well, it'll eventually make its way through all of the Great Lakes, which is what we're starting to see happen. And so this ballast water has been being drained into the St. Lawrence Seaway for years and years, and it has brought countless invasives into our Great Lakes. And a famous example is the zebra mussel, and you can see here that they are very much a pest. If you look at this prop, they are all over the place. Their numbers are in the trillions in the lakes region. And what is happening in Lake Michigan right now is that the water is becoming clearer because the zebra mussels are eating all of the phytoplankton, or the algae, and this is the basis of the food chain. And since they're eating all of the base of the food chain, they were seeing a collapse in ecosystem there. Oops. So overharvesting is our next cause of biodiversity declines, which is intuitive. So we had historically, these are some pretty cool animals that are kind of mind-blowing to think ever exist. There's the giant ground sloth, and in scale, here is the person. And so sloths move slowly, and they're an easy target, just like the dodo was an easy target. Remembering that we're going to kill and eat the easiest thing that we can when we're hunting. And we always think of the desert when we think of camels, but there was a North American camel called the camelope. And so we hunted them to extinction, unfortunately.